Welcome to a video where I show you my entire process of creating an 80s inspired motel from beginning to end using Blender, Substance Painter, Photoshop, and of course throwing it all into Unity. Now for this project I had one main goal, to figure out how to implement texture atlases into my project, which is something I have never done before with any of my 3D models, which turns out is pretty important for optimizing your game. Although I did experience some bumps along the way, it was 100% worth the hassle. Now before this video kicks off, I do want to give a quick disclaimer. Some of the recordings got corrupted in the very beginning. I couldn't tell you how that happened, but it is totally fine. Most of the recordings are still intact and in the video. Just letting you guys know in case anyone is like, did I miss that part? You didn't miss anything because that part of the video doesn't exist. So basically, what my plan is today is to texture this cube that we got here, this little motel section. And basically, which I did some research and I found out what texture atlasing is. And you may be asking, what is texture atlasing? Cut to the A texture atlas is an image containing multiple smaller images, usually packed together to reduce overall dimensions. In an application where many small textures are used frequently, it is often more efficient to store the textures in a texture atlas, which is treated as a single unit by the graphics hardware. We're going to be doing that today. So the way that I understand it is that I can still separately texture each object or each little section of this cube thing, and then I want to take it into Photoshop and then combine them into one large image. So we're gonna see how that works, and it may work and may not. We will figure it out. So while Substance Painter is baking these textures, what this does basically is so every single model has a UV map, and it's almost like you take a cube, like like a box, and then you unbox it. That's pretty much what UV unwrapping does. So it takes all of the meshes and all of like the parts of my model, and then in Blender, when you UV unwrap it, you pretty much unfold each part of the model. I kind of want to go for almost a little vintage feel for this texturing process. So we're gonna see how that goes. So whenever I make models for my game, I have to keep a few things in mind. It needs to be low poly, but also look realistic. That's when the texturing and lighting comes in. Texturing definitely does most of the heavy lifting here, which is why I think it's pretty important to spend a good amount of time texturing your model. Now, whenever I'm texturing any wood material in Substance Painter, I almost always add an edge wear generator to the mesh. This just kind of adds extra detail around the sharp edges where natural wear and tear occurs, and I think it's a really cool effect to add when you want to make your wooden objects look a little more realistic. Another helpful tip is using the dirt generator, which generates dirt on your mesh. It's pretty self-explanatory. So, after some time, here's the result of the first texturing process. Now it was time to work on the motel sign. While modeling this motel, I had the idea that it should be set in a pine forest of some sorts, or just a forest in general, so I wanted the sign to look like a pine tree. It was honestly an interesting shape to work with, but I had a lot of fun messing around with the model and just trying different things and seeing what works. This was my original idea that I sketched out, and I think it really helped me visualize what I wanted the sign to look like. For this specific model, I went for a different approach when UV unwrapping, but basically, I separated each part of my mesh into pieces but kept them all in the same material. And then, I UV unwrapped them like usual. The important part here though is that because each piece of the mesh is in the same material, you can do this thing called packing the UV islands, which makes it so much easier to make a texture atlas. So, with the texturing of the sign, I think this is where I finally found a great color scheme for the entire motel. Honestly, I just kind of chose the colors without a specific plan, but I knew that I definitely wanted to capture that 80s, pastel, nostalgic, almost postmodern vibe, and then mix it with the rustic, dark, and earthy natural textures to create an interesting contrast. And eventually, I settled on a dark wood material for the border and then a dark green background for the sign. I also wanted to incorporate some kind of fun pattern into the sign, and what I chose was definitely something experimental and fun, but I went with this polka dot pattern. I know polka dots are more around the 1950s, but I thought it would be fun to add them and introduce some styles from different eras. I think it's fun to imagine that the motel has been around for a long time before the main events of the game that I'm making, which is set in 1984, and that throughout the years maybe it's had some renovations done to keep up with the current styles of architecture. I also wanted the entire motel to not be super well kept and clean. I didn't want it to look abandoned, but I also didn't want it to be in pristine condition. So to fix that, I added some water damage around the letters and some other dirt and grime on the sign. The sign's also probably like 30 feet in the air, so I don't imagine that the workers will be cleaning it regularly, so I think that could be a good explanation for why it's so dirty. Finally, I brought the textures into Blender, and then here's the result. So, now that the main parts of the motel are completed, it's time to start modeling the entire motel, because right now we still only have this little section. So, let's get to it. Now originally, my plan was to have this be a really big 2-story motel with a bunch of railings, stairs, and other decor, but after a while I guess it didn't really fit my vision. Like I mentioned previously, I wanted it to be kind of a small vintage and rustic forest roadside stop, and I didn't want to go with anything too fancy. So for the entire model, I decided to go for a U-shaped design. I think it was pretty common back then and it felt right to me, and I would show you the process of creating the rest of the motel, but I lost some of the footage. So unfortunately, this is the only video I have of the U-shape I'm talking about. And as you can see, I also added a parking lot and sidewalk to the model so that the player can walk around the motel, as well as a shingled roof and an office sign. You can also see some other little assets sprinkled around like placemats, power boxes, and other support beams around the motel to make it have some more interesting geometry. And here's what the full motel looks like. And finally, after many days and nights, which is only about 5 minutes for you watching this video, it's time to throw the model into Unity. Now I'm gonna be honest, bringing the model from Blender to Unity is nothing special for me at least. I had a few issues where the materials weren't lining up correctly or the normals weren't facing the right direction. So unfortunately, it was a lot of back and forth between the two, but I eventually got it set up and all ready to go. Now, like I mentioned previously, I really wanted to add some life into the scene, so I sprinkled around some assets I already made in the past, like this ice machine, this vending machine, these chairs. The list honestly goes on, but these extra objects really help sell that this is a motel set in the late 80s. After some time of working on the scene and looking for improvements to the model, I decided that there should be some movement. Everything is kind of static and just very still, and I want it to feel like the world is breathing. So what's a good way to add some movement? Flags! I think they turned out pretty good, honestly. It was also my first time using the cloth modifier in Unity, so that was pretty cool too. But now that all the extra objects are finally out of the way, it's time to start sculpting the terrain. Now I'm going to be so honest with you, whenever I'm doing terrain in Unity, I find it really relaxing and therapeutic, so there will be pretty big jumps in progression. I didn't record much. I just kind of forgot to record. So yeah, I do apologize in advance. Oopsies! During the making of this scene, I decided I want to put a diner across the street, which I do plan to make a video on, but for right now, I just used a cube as a placeholder to get the terrain around it right. I started by sculpting some basic hills behind the diner and playing around with the brushes to see what worked best, and while sculpting I did keep in mind that I wanted to have some sunlight peeking over the hills, almost like a sunset, and I do think that with the lens flares it'll look really nice. Another thing to keep in mind is that most of this terrain will be covered with trees, bushes, grass, and other plants, so the sculpting doesn't have to be super realistic, and I gradually faded out the hills the further away they were from the motel, as the surrounding fog would do most of the work in hiding the flat parts of the terrain. And I finished off the first side with some noise brushes and other cliff and erosion brushes to add some more detail, and then I did the same thing to the opposite side, which finished the first part of the terrain. Taking it back to movement for a second and making the scene feel less static, another great way to add some movement, especially in scenes with a ton of foliage, is adding the illusion of wind. Having wind blowing through the trees and grass, and maybe even some leaves falling to the ground, makes the scene feel much more alive. So that's exactly what I did. I experimented with a few different ways of adding grass and trees to the terrain, but I eventually settled on just scattering some models I've made in the past on the terrain with the tree tool. To ensure that these trees wouldn't affect the performance too much, I created prefabs with different LODs, so that the further away you were from the tree it would fade into a cross plane and then eventually just disappear. I scattered some bushes around and some other random plants and rocks, painted the terrain with some mud, rock, and pebble textures, and with that, the terrain is finally complete. Now, for the most part, our motel scene is complete. Obviously, in the future, I'd like to add NPCs, cars, and of course the diner, but the motel itself is done. With all that being said, if you made it this far in the video, I really do appreciate it. And I guess there's nothing else to do now but show you the final result.